right, welcome everybody back to I believe our first colloquium of spring quarter. Some of you know me, I'm Ramesh Srinivasan, I'm an associate professor here in our department. I'm so psyched to have Marisa come and visit us. We met probably about 10 years ago at the University of Washington, and I've been sort of paying attention to Marisa's work over the last decade, which is really, really important in my mind. And my colleague Lisa Parks and I have been writing about, for example, a proposal and some other things we're writing. We've been writing about the idea of sovereignty, kind of a political science construct, and how we think about a tribal legal construct, and how we think about sovereignty in relation to technology and networks and ownership and power and agency in relation to networks. And we kept turning to your work as we were thinking about these kinds of questions and themes in different kinds of contexts all across the world. So just to kind of give a quick bio, which is highly impressive, Marisa Duarte is Vasco Yaqui is Assistant Professor of Justice and Socio-Technical Change, what a cool title, with the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. Her work focuses on native and indigenous uses of information and communication technologies toward resistance and endurance. Marisa received her PhD in information science from the University of Washington, I guess that's when we met, and where she founded, or co-founded, the Indigenous Information Research Group, a team of Native and Indigenous researchers focusing on the impacts of information, knowledge, and technology in Indigenous contexts. And I remember we had a Zuni friend in common too, who was friends with my friends at Zuni.
That's right.
Yeah. And her book, Network Sovereignty, which is exactly the term that I'm playing with a lot in my writing these days. Network Sovereignty, Building the Internet in Indian Country, is coming out next month. So we're lucky, great timing. Through the University of Washington Press, Marisa is a member of the Human Security Collab at ASU, which focuses on intersectional, feminist, and decolonial approaches to data. Through the School of Social Transformation, Marisa teaches indigenous methodologies, digital activism, and theories of justice. And your most recent work includes social network analysis of Native American Twitter activist uses during the 2016 presidential election. I'd love to hear about that in the context of DAPL as well, and so on. And you're currently writing a report of the vision work behind the design of an IMLS-funded national digital platform for disseminating Native authored writings through the Amherst College Kim Eisenberg Native American Literary Collection. And that's a reminder that all of us should do everything we can to try to fight to save IMLS and also the National Endowment for the Humanities, National Endowment for the Arts, and essentially all our rights. So, on that positive note, welcome.
Thank you. So I'll start this by asking, how many of you went to Standing Rock? Okay. All right. And okay, so I'm saying that for two reasons. One, because I'll be talking about Standing Rock. And I did not get to go to Standing Rock because I was teaching theories of justice, which was an interesting moment to be teaching that moment in U.S. history. But I'll say that, and I'll also say that for my colleagues from Yoriaki. I'll be talking about Yoriaki. And so since I'm talking about such tense moments, I just want you to know that, what I'm doing is I'm trying to paint a big picture. And I acknowledge that, there's a lot in there that's very traumatic and very hard. And so I just want you to know I'm there with you on how hard that is, and we have to make room for that through this whole conversation. This is not entirely theoretical. This is very visceral and close to home. So, okay, so I go ahead and begin. Okay, so what do you think you can teach Indigenous peoples? And what do you think Indigenous peoples can teach you? I'm Indigenous and I'm also an information scientist. I publish in both fields. And it's most effective for me to think of this in the company of scholars such as yourself. And the reason why I want to do that is because these fields are extraordinarily important that we bring them into conversation. Information scientists can build just about anything they really want to. For us, it's just a matter of getting access to technical people of resources and so forth. But really, the know-how is there. But Indigenous peoples know the struggles. So how do we bring those together into conversation in very powerful places, such as at UCLA, right? So I'm hoping we can talk about this together. But to frame that conversation, what I'm going to do is share these 3 scenarios with you. I'm going to talk about DAPL and informatic warfare in Indian country. I'll talk about the paper that we just wrote, #Indigenous, information sharing from below. And I'll talk about, connecting beyond the interface vision work at Amherst College. These scenarios reveal 3 overarching findings, read all together. So the first is that Native and Indigenous peoples' experiences of colonization, resistance to colonization, and drive for self-determination over time have resulted in a particular place-based set of approaches to, this is the info-sci, specificity, reception, acceptance, interpretation, communication, transmission, and diffusion of information, inclusive of the data, devices, socio-technical systems, and assemblages through which that information flows. Why does it need to be so precise? Because we have these fields we're working in, right? Information management, information behavior, right? HCI, socio-technical approaches. Native and Indigenous peoples' approaches to information are adaptive, innovative, and often cohere to specific existing worldviews within a greater resistant imaginary. So now I'm speaking to the social justice people, the Indigenous thinkers. Native and Indigenous peoples' approaches to information represent sites within which to discern the social and political power and dimensions of information. So now I'm talking to the political scientists. Just a reminder, I study information in real-life social and political contexts. My prior research on tribal internet infrastructure reveals how histories of ICTs are intertwined with histories of U.S. colonization, sovereignty, and self-determination. American Indians are not minorities. A lot of people think they are, but they rather represent an exceptional class of citizens representing over 586 nations bearing legal, sovereign relationships with the federal government. The U.S. defined its relationship with tribes through the legal and political mechanisms shaped with 13 colonies through the Civil War, Manifest Destiny, and westward expansion. That was a big idea in about 10 seconds. I'm just getting you ready for a lot more of those. In the 19th century, the telegraph wire was strung alongside railroad beds to transmit information about Indian mobilization to the U.S. military. Contemporary misrepresentation and appropriation of Native arts and images stems from the practices of early American ethnographers. Many built careers validating the American delusion that Indians are primitive, pre-modern, prehistoric, and deserving of social and political subjugation. Raised to the level of false consciousness, the settlers' belief in the primitive and anti-technological nature of Indians shaped American policies such as, here's another, the big pain, the forced removal of tribal peoples from their homelands, massacres and killing of peoples, including women, children, and elders, theft of Indian lands, water, children, religious objects, bodies of the dead, and personal belongings, prohibition of indigenous histories and philosophies, sexual assault of women, and the willful subjugation of sovereign tribal rights through American jurisprudence. So we see here a 2-row wampum belt. This is a document, right? Librarians, this is a document, indicating the treaty and trust relationship between early Dutch settlers and Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy. The purple and the white indicate the intertwined past of the distinct peoples with their forms of government. The concept of distinct peoples with intertwined ways of life emerged again 350 years later when Martin Luther King Jr. wrote from the confines of Birmingham jail, "In a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere." So for American Indians, injustice is a way of life. When Dr. King was in jail, religious leaders urged him to let the courts handle the complaints of black people in the Jim Crow South. However, what members of the privileged class do not understand is that, especially in a liberal democracy, the institutions through which justice is assured often do not hear the needs of the poor, marginalized, and oppressed. In those situations, the oppressed put their bodies on the line because lacking financial and political clout, that is all they command. People around them bear witness to the epistemic injustice. So beyond interpersonal or contractual injustice, epistemic injustice occurs when a dominant social order is conditioned not to see, hear, make sense of, describe, or adjudicate a series of moral, ethical, and legal wrongs committed against a people. Different from ignorance, epistemic injustice reifies itself as institutions like the press, law enforcement, the courts, town halls, and universities marginalize democratic deliberation, and in the case of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe and the Dakota Access Pipeline, sovereign government-to-government negotiation. You should feel a little destabilized right now, unless you're Native, and you feel more. When oppressed people put their bodies on the line, they experience warfare. Beginning in the summer of 2016, residents and activists observed increasing militarization around Standing Rock Sioux Tribe. The Morton County Sheriff collaborated with DAPL Private Security to barricade construction sites. Law enforcement turned local drivers away from their routes to work and home and pulled over drivers they suspected of being rabble-rousers. While the tribe submitted legal documentation to the courts, the Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. Justice Department demonstrating the unlawful construction of the pipeline, thousands of Standing Rock Sioux supporters visited the area and volunteered in the growing protest camps. Many Morton County townspeople engaged in hateful acts against Standing Rock supporters. Store owners refused to sell goods to water protectors, as they call themselves, even though the townspeople themselves voted to prevent the pipeline from being constructed through their community for fear of contamination. Standing Rock supporters engaged in prayer marches and direct action tactics while facing law enforcement and security armed with assault weaponry, batons, pepper spray, tear gas, rubber bullets, rifles, bulletproof vests, gas masks, armored vehicles, drones, sound cannons, and water cannons. Did you all see that on the news? I'm missing a slide. That's too bad. Morton County law enforcement and DAPL security at one point erected an observation station on top of a hill, Turtle Island, overlooking the campsites. Turtle Island is the site of the Lakota Cemetery and bears spiritual and philosophical significance for Lakota teachings about the origin of humanity. When activists attempted to visit Turtle Island in prayer, security soaked them in tear gas at close range, like if I was soaking Ramesh, like right here. By December 4th, outraged by the use of military tactics against civilians, over 10,000 U.S. veterans voluntarily traveled to Standing Rock, prepared to engage in frontline action. Only then was there a temporary stop to the drilling, and DAPL said that it was due to the inclement weather. The Standing Rock Sioux Tribe and camp leaders asked activists to return to their homes due to the winter and a persistent cough that many feared was pneumonia, but which public health officials are reporting as overexposure to the rat poison chlorphacinon, or Rozol. Residents and activists had watched planes drop thousands of gallons of chemicals over the campsites in the months prior. Hundreds of activists had been arrested and charged with felonies, so the crimes they committed were for the most part civil acts of disobedience. Usually these are worth no more than misdemeanors. By then, the FBI Terrorism Task Force was surveilling Standing Rock activists in the style of COINTELPRO. So of interest to the information scientists are the strategies the groups applied to transmit information during this time, particularly as these relate to what military theorist Brian Massamy calls onto power. So onto power is the power to produce a particular form of life, a life will take next. The cognitive aspects of knowledge, which is probably most familiar to information scientists, are based on decisions that have already been made through accurate and actionable collection of data and focus on the availability, reliability, manipulability, and usability of data. We're good at that. Information scientists are really good at that. Onto power, however, is the force of life that occurs in the pre-decision process, before knowability and actionability have differentiated from one another. A social group that harnesses onto power defines perception ahead of time and harnesses fear of the unknown through setting up infrastructures of preemptive action and deterrence, such that any challenge to their way of knowing the world is cognitively processed as a threat to the entire society. Centuries of U.S. policies positioning American Indians as threats to civil society turned the very institutions that are supposed to uphold legal and social justice for all into spaces for the subjugation of American Indian legal, civil, and human rights. So how do we see this at Standing Rock? How do we see onto power in motion there? And we see it through the issues of media coverage and surveillance. So in the U.S., we support a free press so that American citizens can know the workings of their government, right? We hope Americans will reasonably deliberate. We hope. We really hope. However, from the spring of 2016 through the beginning of the bitterly cold winter, finding news about DAPL and Standing Rock depended on one's proximity to independent citizen journalists in Indian country. Those of us in tribal communities have been observing our young people taking longer and longer trips to Standing Rock since the spring. Our people describe the brutality of the officers, as well as hopeful lessons learned from others within the camps. We followed updates from Indian Country Today and Native rights blogs, but mostly relied on messages from friends and relatives at the camps and reservation. In September, Democracy Now! Journalist Amy Goodman was arrested for covering DAPL's use of attack dogs. The story went viral by virtue of Goodman's name. That's important to remember. When DAPL security and Morton County officers began using the LRAD, or sound cannon, in late September, the absence of mass media coverage was notable. At one point in late summer, over a day, officers encircled a camp of activists and elders. Young activists jumped on top of buses, live streaming footage of officers forcing elders out of teepees at gunpoint. Activists hid under vehicles to escape being beaten with batons. Snipers shot rubber bullets at the activists filming on top of buses. During the live streams, viewers commented, "Where is the media?" Kiowa independent journalist Tristan Auton wrote, "It's as if the press is engaged in a group conspiracy to expedite the destruction of America's indigenous people by ignoring their dynamic lives, voices, struggles, and contributions." Certain activists were being intermittently blocked from posting updates via Facebook. In an area with limited internet access, citizen journalists climbed hills to upload coverage of the day's events. Groups like Unicorn Riot, Digital Smoke Signals, Last Real Indians, and Longhouse Media, which had consisted of media specialists more accustomed to wireless networking, blog posting, and coverage of native arts, found themselves working like war zone reporters, wearing bandanas to prevent inhalation of tear gas, while narrating crises through the lens of cameras affixed to mics and smartphones. They faced arrests like Goodman, but without dedicated legal representation or recognition of journalistic rights. In October, after weeks of intensifying violence, major news organizations finally sent reporters. I observed one major network reporter broadcasting in the no-travel zone hundreds of feet behind the DAPL armored vehicles. By the time the mainstream media arrived, the terms by which ordinary citizens could make sense of the impacts of DAPL were oriented toward a foregone conclusion. The Indians are going to lose, and what a tragedy that is. This is familiar. Or, the Indians are going to lose and our American courts need to be stronger for those situations. Or, the Indians are going to lose and they deserve to, because even if the police were rough, the police were forced to be that way because it's against the law to threaten or sabotage major U.S. energy infrastructure. Now, philosopher Jose Medina theorizes epistemic injustice as the outcomes of groups of people who, habitually arrogant, closed-minded, and intellectually lazy, profit by not seeing the suffering of oppressed peoples around them. Onto power grants institutional leaders the legitimacy to invest in seeing, responding, and acting on the suffering of oppressed peoples only insofar as it normalizes or makes profitable their suffering. In 2009, military theorist Antoine Bousquet characterized the shift from predictable linear models of diplomatic warfare to nonlinear chaoplexity, in which analysts apply advanced algorithmic modeling to detect patterns in a swarm of probable actors and information. A headache and a half for security analysts, applying predictive analytics requires an ideal assemblage of actionable and reliable on-the-ground intelligence, digital data points, advanced algorithmic techniques, and scientists to interpret them, in addition to regulations that protect citizen privacy rights and the operational logic of national security. I was just in a workshop with former Department of Homeland Security analyst Michael Shertoff. Yes, he is not a fan of these kind of, because they impinge on citizen privacy rights. It actually weakens the entire national security apparatus to be catching terrorists through the networks. Alleged terrorism. Any scientist who has attempted one of those methodologies can attest garbage in, garbage out. But under the logic of onto power, and from the perspective of law enforcement, just the possibility of an opposing social group having more actionable information than law enforcement in itself represents an actionable threat. If they just think that you have more information than they do about a cause, that is sufficient grounds to begin pursuing surveillance modalities. In the fall, hundreds of thousands of activists used Facebook to deceptively check into the campsites in an effort to flood the Morton County Sheriff with false information. The Sheriff's Department used their own Facebook page to post alleged evidence of law-breaking among activists, including photos of crudely made stone hatchets termed weapons. We're more civilized than that. We use guns. That was a terrible joke. There were no guns there, as well as counter-narratives privileging their interpretations of obvious instances of police brutality. This is very scary, that we have a sheriff department using their own Facebook to say, no, you guys got it all wrong, we weren't beating that person. This is what we were doing, right? Indigenous Environmental Network activist Dallas Goldtooth uses Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook accounts to thank people for their support while simultaneously assuring them that their check-in wasn't likely going to change the course of action for Morgan County law enforcement. However, true to the nature of chaoplexic warfare, Goldtooth was unable to infer how intelligence analysts at different levels of government would interpret this surge in social media attention. Department of Homeland Security intelligence analysts pursued protocols to surveil the social media of Standing Rock activists. The FBI Terrorism Task Force contacted activists in the Washington area. Each week, independent investigative journalists submitted Freedom of Information Act requests from Muckrock, revealing patterns around upper Midwest law enforcement purchases and uses of Stingray cell tower interceptors and surveillance gear. Onto Power thrives on paranoia. Who is watching who? Which party will strike the first blow? From what direction will it come, and how badly will it hurt? The majority of American citizens do not suffer daily hypersurveillance, and I agree with recent research that suggests that they do not experience the physical sensations of it, the visceral experience of surveillance, as deeply as those who do. Black Americans, undocumented people, Muslims, formerly incarcerated people, and Native Americans. Most American citizens do not know that COINTELPRO targeted Black American and American Indian activists in the 1960s and 1970s, resulting in the murder of Black Panther leaders and the 1973 standoff that wounded me. For American Indians, hypersurveillance occurs as agencies within the federal government collect different kinds of data from natives at varying points in a single month, including through visits with Child Protective Services, public health agencies, parole boards, and social services. I might add, and anthropologists. Read against maps of the natural resources embedded in native lands, it is easy to see why the mainstream media habitually frames narratives of Indians as impoverished and ill-prepared denizens of an oil-hungry, advancing techno-scientific nation-state. There are few knowledge institutions from which American Indians can structurally challenge this powerful trope. Oh, darn it. Okay, so now we're going to take a mental break so I can put in the correct slide that shows my table that you probably may or may not be able to see. But I'm going to shift gears and talk about that Twitter data set. And while I shift gears, I'll just indicate, have any of you used Muckrock before, by any chance? I would highly recommend that you Google Standing Rock, like search for Standing Rock in Muckrock. So Muckrock is it's a website where independent investigative journalists post every time they submit a Freedom of Information request, and they also post the responses so that you can, the public can have access to that information. Let me see here. And, no, this is not it. But it is really somewhat disturbing, some of the stuff that you will see in Muckrock. It's very disturbing, and it's also really challenging. Just when I was on the plane, actually, I have a colleague at the University of Arizona who's starting to do work on data sovereignty, tribal data sovereignty issues. And the FBI just contacted her as well, so they have an interest. And the data set that we used for the study that I'm about to talk about right now, we actually had to destroy that data set because I became very concerned that it would be used against tribal people in an unjust way. So it is for the above-mentioned reasons that Zapatista leader Subcomandante Marcos encouraged indigenous activists to build communication networks from below. In my book, Network Sovereignty, I assert that tribes that have command over their own internet backbones are able to provide the infrastructure for digital expression in Indian country. In need of a study demonstrating the need for network engineering in Indian country, research in Indian country, network scientist Morgan V. Hill Hayes contacted me to partner on a study examining uses of Twitter by Native American rights advocates during the 2016 presidential election. We sought data about the qualities and size of content as well as the dynamic circulation of tweets through social networks, because we could then make quantitatively verifiable argument about the minimal amount of bandwidth required to support the work of Native American rights activists, from citizen journalists to scholars to policymakers working from remote and rural locations. So this is all before Standing Rock. We were already wondering how are folks going to upload in real time, news from the field. So I included Nicolette Deshini Parkhurst, a noted young American Indian rights advocate, digital divide researcher, and public policy graduate students to assist us. We wanted in particular to speak back to this GAO report, Government Accounting Office report, that was sort of looking at the impacts of federal subsidies to help tribes create their own internet infrastructure from years prior. So from February 11th to March, this is the terrible. This is the required science slide. I'm a scientist. Here it is, right? So I'm not just a terrible radical rabble rouser, I'm truly a scientist too. So from February 11th to March 31, 2016, we collected over 11,000 tweets from a set of 2,086 content creators. We curated our originating set of hashtags and user accounts based on a survey of native rights activists. We extrapolated more hashtags and user accounts 2 levels outside of that originating set, and that produced a very small but precise set. And we compared that with the general public Twitter data set collected through the same time. So I hypothesized, all of us actually hypothesized, that we were going to see evidence of the presidential, election in some way, in these Twitter streams, right? I was like, surely we're going to see something about Clinton, something about Sanders, something about getting people to vote, because there was one point where we're mapping it out, and you can see there are spikes sort of in what's circulating through the native Twitter sphere, right? A very small sample, but you can nevertheless see it. We were dead wrong. We were so wrong. We found very limited evidence of content addressing the 2016 presidential election in the Native American data set. While the general data set reveals 75,629 tweets directed at real Donald Trump from February 11th to March 31st, with 97.6% of those continually circulating through 24 hours, the Native American Advocates data set revealed only 5 tweets directed at real Donald Trump. It's not even proportional. For the general data set, 8 of the top 100 hashtags related to political action included hashtag Trump 2016, hashtag Trump, hashtag Feel the Burn, hashtag We Are Burning, hashtag Cruise Crew, hashtag GOP debate, hashtag Dem debate, and hashtag PJNet. Notice that there's no Clinton in that set. We didn't realize until retrospect that in the general Twitter data set, in the early spring, it was Trump and Bernie, the polarization, right? For the Native American Advocates data set, 3 out of 8 of the top 100 hashtags related to political action focused on transnational indigenous politics. Oh my God, embarrassing. It's a pregnant student loan officer. I think it is. So in 2000, the native stuff, the top 3, hashtag CDN Poly, which is Canadian politics, hashtag AUS Poly, Australian politics, hashtag FN Poly, First Nation politics. 3 were for Bernie Sanders, hashtag Feel the Burn, hashtag We Are Burning, hashtag Natives for Bernie, and 2 were to promote native voting, Native Vote 2016. So in 2009, political theorist James Tully asserted that Indigenous needs are not well represented by national political parties. Structurally, Indigenous peoples are pushed to participate in a Spielraum, the momentary interstices created between competing national political powers. Our analysis revealed that Native American advocates were more likely to tweet continually about life and death issues rather than about U.S. partisan politics. The 5 largest subtopical groups in our Native American Advocates data set were focused around systemic injustice of American Indians, systemic injustice of First Nations peoples, including missing and murdered Indigenous women, police brutality, colonialism, and appropriation and representation. Binding all of these subgroups, hashtag Indigenous functioned like glue, a technical boundary spanner carrying tweets from one dynamic subcommunity to another, revealing the transnational nature of Indigenous tweets about distinct yet comparable experiences of colonialism. So, does anybody do social network analysis? You get what I'm talking about, right? So it's like we've got the whole data set, if you can imagine sort of like this web, this constantly moving web, and we've got these subcommunities within that data set. And in the native one, we've got subcommunities focused on different life and death issues. They're all life and death issues, but they're different life and death issues. And the hashtag Indigenous is what's binding those different communities. So we would have environmental justice, tweets popping up that didn't have to do with native stuff per se, but that were nevertheless, because it was coded with hashtag Indigenous, was carrying that content into ones that had to do with like the American Indian Red Power movement, things like that. So I've been telling all activists, if you're trying to push stuff out on Twitter, social media, use the hashtag Indigenous. Super powerful. It'll carry it much further. Methodologically, however, another kind of analysis is needed to understand how Indigenous rights advocates working in distinct contexts apply relevant digital tactics. Nation-states marginalize Indigenous denizens in ways that maximize the structural power of elites. Indigenous peoples' digital tactics are thus shaped by the kinds of resistance essential to their endurance within their geopolitical locale. When we look beyond the Twitter interface into the tactics of specific movements, we can appreciate why in one context, Indigenous environmental rights groups might widely photograph their plight, as in the case of the 2012 wave of I Don't Know More flash mobs, while in another, Indigenous environmental rights activists might avoid digital dissemination, as in the ongoing case of Rioyaki Justicia and Namagasia movements. Different country contexts. These different countries have different orientations to the diffusion of information, censorship, and free speech rights. So in early 2012, Canadian Prime Minister Harper threatened First Nations treaty rights to pave the way for oil and natural resource extraction. 4 women combined their social media activists, educator, and web programming skill to craft the messaging of the I Don't Know More movement. First Nations and U.S., Canada Indigenous rights activists hosted teach-ins and circulated memes, news, and policy updates tagged hashtag I Don't Know More through their social networks. I Don't Know More supporters hosted prayer rallies and flash mobs at locations signifying the neoliberal erosion of native homelands, border crossings, public parks, malls, interstate highways, major city intersections, and town squares. I observed the unfolding of multiple I Don't Know More flash mobs in different countries and cities, not through cable news, but rather through my Facebook news feed. My relatives in southern New Mexico and Arizona learned about I Don't Know More, not through the free press, but because I showed them videos and photos on my phone. On the other hand, my Colloquium relatives were watching another Indigenous rights protest unfold, one which was not circulating through the same social media networks as I Don't Know More. In Rioyaki, the traditional and sacred homelands of my people, corporations and governments have partnered to illegally construct a dam pumping hectares of water from Rioyaki in Sonora, Mexico, in direct violation of Yaqui water rights. Even though the Supreme Court found the construction of the dam illegal, the theft of the water continued unabated. The governor of Sonora had pledged to pay the tuition of all Yaqui students enrolled in state colleges as a kind of nod to the illicit use of the water. Students enrolled and the governor reneged, leaving poor families in debt. So can you imagine? I mean, you know, like if UCLA was just like, they offered like federal grants and whatever, and they would tell students, okay, your tuition is paid, don't worry, come to class, and then they just don't, and don't want to talk about it anymore. So, in protest, environmental activist groups coordinate a blockade of the single north-south interstate through the region. Drivers of semis carrying produce and goods from southern Mexico to U.S. ports of entry turned their engines off at Vicam Switch and the heart of the Yaqui Autonomous Zone in Sonora. Yet, due to linguistic differences, among other factors, news of the blockades was hardly noticed in the English-speaking Indigenous world, and much less by American mass media. So, while First Nations and Native American activists engaged in bold and strategic digital dissemination of content about I Don't Know More, Rioyaki activists kept digital communications to a relative minimum. This was in part due to limited internet connectivity throughout the areas, but also because the governor of Sonora and corporate partners were engaging in brutal acts, including kidnappings, threats of physical violence, and paying individuals to harass and intimidate activists. A state propaganda campaign was in full swing. Human rights observers collected information for use in what has now become a 5-fold human rights legal strategy against the state of Mexico. Driving north from Sonora through Arizona, one can still see billboards inviting tourists to scuba dive in places in which Rioyaki residents have told me are recent villages submerged by the waters of the dam. With transnational drug trafficking organizations threatening the lives of Mexican journalists and private security threatening activists, the cost of data disseminated through social media networks has become too high for Yaqui activists to bear, and many prefer face-to-face communications. So it is for these reasons stated above, neoconservative violence against Indigenous peoples, neoliberal extraction from Indigenous homelands, surveillance regimes, and habitual perpetuation of ignorance about Indigenous liveways and histories, that I find it most radical and rejuvenating when libraries intentionally partner with Indigenous peoples toward meaningful work. In 1978, Dakota scholar Vine Laurie Jr. spoke at a White House conference on library services to American Indians. He asserted the librarian's role in providing American Indians with books and materials through which American Indians could learn about the nature of their oppression. If the U.S. intends to break every promise with American Indians, then the need for librarians to uphold an American Indian's right to know grows even greater. With this thought in mind, I'm going to close with something positive, with an example of restorative justice and academic librarianship. Last June, I helped convene 25 American Indian archivists, librarians, museum professionals, filmmakers, and scholars at Amherst College. For 2 days, we discussed a concept. If we could design a digital interface for a collection of 2,500 documents written by Native American authors from the 17th century to the present, what might it look like? What might it work like? What values would inform its design and use, and how would it radically transform the relationship between Amherst College and area tribes? Agarwal suggested that to avoid habitual exploitation of Indigenous peoples, project leaders should include Indigenous peoples as partners in the epistemic design process of databases and interfaces. Amherst College librarians Michael Kelly and Kelsey Shepard appreciated this idea and worked with Indigenous scholars Lisa Brooks and Kira Hill to acquire an IMLS grant for planning that repository. I joined the project a few months after they received the grant. We talked about how to bring in tribal regional partners, how to make room for conversations about the colonial roots of classification, ethnography, and intellectual property, how to acknowledge historical trauma, and how to infuse Indigenous orientations to tribal sovereignty. Native ways of knowing and philosophies of interconnectedness and relationality. By June, the steering committee was well prepared to hear the visions and ideas of representatives from such groups as the American Philosophical Association, the National Museum of American Indians, Vision Maker Media, the Ashuwi-Awan Museum and Heritage Center in Zuni, Miranda's group, the Sequoia National Research Center, the Waiwa Library at UBC, and the Newberry Library, among others. With an overarching vision based on principles of relationality, respect, reciprocity, and responsibility, the group defined 4 areas of work, including indigenizing design processes, constructing the system and interfaces to empower Indigenous futures, regulating protocols and ethics across Indigenous and non-Indigenous institutions and groups, and sustaining the system for future generations. Let's see. What is my next slide? Oh, okay. Then I can tell a good story. So the group discussed the contemporary discursive, technical, and social networking of Native knowledge objects as a challenge to the historical practice of removing and isolating Native artifacts from the people who made them. We talked about the specter of genocide by weaving through the system opportunities where researchers and students connect with tribal elders and educators through story work, and where tribal people connect with each other to restore the energy of what is unwritten, subjugated histories, tribal interpretations, and ways of knowing. After an intense first day of discussion, in which we particularly criticized the concept of the walled garden, one librarian had a dream that she shared with us the next morning. She dreamed her grandmother handed her a gourd filled with dried seeds, and asked her to take care of it for future visitors. Abenaki historian Mark Bouchard helped us conceptualize the epistemic vision for the project. The town of Amherst, is anybody from Amherst, Massachusetts? That part of the country? So Amherst is named after Lord Geoffrey Amherst, the British military commander who's famous for the distribution of smallpox blankets during Pontiac's War in 1763. So when I got there, I was staying at this it's an inn, it's called Lord Geoffrey, and I was like, well, this is nice. Nice linens, nice towels. Yeah, nice blankets, very soft. So Amherst rests on the slope of the Connecticut River Valley. It's a region filled with Indigenous histories, including the Earth Shaper stories. More than a century before Dutch colonization, this is before the Wampum Belt, right? Pocumtuck peoples lived beside an Earth Shaper. A great beaver was damming the river, hoarding the fish, flooding the basin of Mount Tom, and eating human beings. The great beaver was destroying the natural ecology. A Pocumtuck fisherman hunted the great beaver, following him to his resting place. He speared the great beaver, jamming his head off. The beaver's wide tail slapped the earth as he fell, causing a ridge through which the Connecticut River now flows. Sugarloaf Mountain rests over the beaver's head, and his body lies north of it. The Connecticut River Valley became like a common pot, a bowl from which all the people ate, and which all the people were responsible for sustaining. Earth Shapers teach us about our responsibilities to the ecology of an Indigenous environment. They teach us about forces that disrupt environments, including, in this case, hoarding, destroying ecologies, and eating people out of frustration. While Lord Amherst was not an Earth Shaper, his actions scarred American Indians, and it is in the context of his crimes that Amherst College seeks to restore just relationships with tribes. As a group, we began thinking of building a system for a digitized collection of native authored materials based on the concept of the common pot. Whoever takes knowledge from the common pot must leave something meaningful in return. The tribal and university partners responsible for the system must prevent hoarding, or alternatively, the loss of materials. Building a digital library based on Northeastern Indigenous episteme of the common pot created a way for us to reimagine the corner of the internet for Indigenous purposes. So what can information scientists teach Indigenous peoples? I've given you the answer. This is the prof thing, right? You know, it'll be on the test and then they just copy the slide. Like I told you, I made you listen, but it was the second slide. It's super simplified here, though. When as scholars and practitioners, we conceptualize information as meaningful within a particular ontology, a particular cosmology, and especially once distinct from the emerging American technocracy, we can free ourselves from the techno-scientific ideologies and myths that may fog clear-eyed depictions of contemporary human struggles. In my book, I assert that ghosts and paper are less the enemies of the oppressed than are the living and breathing policymakers, engineers, educators, and corporate heads that every day decide what to see and what not to see, what to read and what not to read, and what vision to manifest in the mundane pursuit of their occupation. To reduce indigenous knowledge to no more than a set of seeds, a digital document, a belt made of shells, or a painting of an iPhone warrior is to ignore the politics of knowledge and the wisdom embedded in ways of knowing. Native and indigenous peoples connect with each other beyond the interface, and the source of their resiliency resides in the nature of those interconnections. So if one studies and writes about indigenous knowledge in the context of colonialism, one begins to appreciate human liberation. As an information scientist, I'm attracted to understanding the moments when the tools we make and use shape the social fabric. Here we are in California, where for California tribes, the weaving of baskets opens new ways to understand biomes, rhythm and pattern, storywork, philosophy, and spirituality, and the craft of making a really good basket. It's still a tool, right? So where do you see your work? That's what I'm wondering, and I'm hoping that we can really have a good conversation. I want to know where you see your work in the weaving of California's indigenous histories. What do you think you might learn from the words of Mandalori Jr. as he asserts an American Indian right to know? Thank you.
I think we have like at least 15 or so minutes, maybe even more, and then we'll take it upstairs afterward, for questions or comments or whatever. So.
Anything, everything. Yes.
So, for like librarians and allied professionals in approaching collaboration with Native communities, I keep thinking about kind of like the idea of like the contact zone in museums, where kind of collaboration is used as like an exploitative method in a lot of ways. Do you have any suggestions on like in approaching and planning these types of programs, how you can, one, invite Native communities, Native members into library spaces while at the same time ensuring that they're not going to be taken advantage by institutions and policies that are like essentially designed to exploit a lot of non-white members?
Yeah. So it depends. So are you talking about? Are you thinking specifically about academic libraries?
Yeah.
Okay. So what academic libraries like to do is they like to use the language of diversity, right? Or inclusivity. That's the institutional language to say, yeah, we are diverse and inclusive. What does that mean? It means they're diverse and inclusive. Okay. There's a list somewhere in the dean's office that says, did you do 10 diversity events this year? And you check them off and it means you're diverse and inclusive. That's literally what it is. So, but what a librarian is doing, who is like, okay, I see we have these materials and I think they're relevant to our local tribal community or indigenous community or whatever. And as a librarian, this is why I love librarians, they're like social justice, public intellectuals, and good readers all at once, And it's like, okay, I want for this to be useful for the tribe, but I don't know what their needs are, per se, which is reasonable. So what happens at that point is that the librarian becomes like a boundary spanner, essentially. A person who is like, I'm going to prettify this language up so that I can get funding from my institution. They get to check off their ridiculous little box in the list somewhere and blah, 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 right? And it also makes me look good, and then I get to keep my job and keep doing cool programs like this because I know, that that's how it is. And it's really hard not to be smarmy about it, right? So you're doing all this and trying to not become cynical, okay? And while you're doing that, you're also educating yourself as much as you can about history of that tribe or that community. Finding books, trying to really understand those documents, and also contacting people there who are doing good work as educators. So what a lot of people imagine when approaching tribal communities is like, oh man, I need to go like right away to the most knowledgeable elder possible. But just because a person is a knowledgeable elder in the community doesn't mean that, number one, they want to talk to you. Number two, they're interested in anything you have to share. And number three, that they're educators in the way that we're familiar with. Sort of American style of education where you're allowed to ask questions and it's like you're supposed to teach in like 15-minute bites and things like that, right? So it's usually best to work with somebody who is an educator in that community already. Whether it's a teacher or somebody who's doing stuff for the Basquiat tribe, I found out that one of our people in Guadalupe is doing a lot of important work with the academic libraries. She is actually she taught high school for years, but she's now working there as a substance abuse prevention educator. And so she was like, well, if I teach people about their history, they'll feel a sense of pride and, one that will help them out as they are having to go through sort of substance withdrawal, protocols, right? So she started working with librarians to find photographs and things like that, having history nights. And the other thing is wrapping in story, so it's like if we're going to actually, the goal is not to just put a bunch of documents on a table and be like, look, and then people are like, wow, that's not how it goes. That might work in fancy museums, but how many of us seriously go to fancy museums on typical, I'm very educated, and I go every 3 months, if I don't feel like watching Netflix, right? So, so why would tribal people, who have very busy lives, want to go drive all the way up to the Getty, or come all the way out to UCLA, pay for parking? It's not going to work out. So the thing to do is to find select documents, and take them out to these communities in places that are comfortable, where you can have kids, where you can have elders who need, special assistance, lots of wheelchairs, where you can have food, and give people time to tell stories about those documents. Because what's valuable about the relationship between institutions and tribes is not over the battle of the document and the meaning. It's about the trust, it's about the trust between those two different groups. That's what's really nourishing. And if you keep on doing that, then you can start to actually build partner programs between those two organizations. Okay, so that is if your library administration doesn't agree with what you're doing, right? If they do agree with what you're doing, and if you have deans on other units on campus that are huge fans, then you can actually start to get memorandums of agreement in place to build full, true exhibits, true programs. I bet this is how we got a lot of stuff done at University of Washington, was because the important administrative leaders across the university really understood and appreciated sovereignty, and they put their money where their mouth was. Yeah. Is that?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for asking.
So the same way as the Gloria wrote the manifesto on, in order to help also communities to get information to find their claims for federal recognition. How do you see that now? How do you see that the digital databases or digital infrastructures in general can help? We're in California, where so many tribes just haven't been recognized, and how hard it is to get that information, and how do you see that things have changed or not with the inclusion of digital into the museum, libraries, and all that to get those documents more open, or even how a database or an archive, or something I just keep thinking of something that can be the knowledge, the pod, something that can help indigenous peoples from a state or somewhere, to get their documents together and really help them to file those claims for federal recognition and to really sovereignty and self-determination.
So the way, sort of the big picture thing is that I'm keenly aware that tribal people are still, and for a very long time, are going to be overcoming the legacy of forced containment, of being forced onto reserves and reservations and not being allowed to speak with each other. And in the case of California, being very shamed and brutalized for speaking the language. Yeah. We have a lot of issues of sexual molestation in California, and the California tribes and the legacy of that, and so you have silences in groups and families about histories. I am keenly aware that there's a lot of money in California, and so Ohlone Esselen Nation, their homelands is on Pebble Beach. Are they going to get Pebble Beach back?
Yeah.
I think Clint Eastwood has a lot of money invested in making sure that Esselen Ohlone Nation never gets their land back, ever. And so in that situation, anytime I get, it was super exciting to me. When I saw Idle No More, all these flash mobs, it was like to me, it was like watching fireworks. I was like, what? This is amazing, because since the late 90s, Manuel Castells, right, was talking about indigenous groups coming together, and using these different kind of technologies to speak back to, unjust corporations and neoliberal apparatus, whatever. but it was like dependent on different tribal people or in different places around the world. Number one, having connectivity, basic connectivity, internet connectivity. Number two, having devices, productivity devices. Number three, being able to afford the connectivity, you know. And then number four, trusting, having people in other, you know, communities to be able to, with whom you would share that, you know, content over a distance. So in that way, I'm really thrilled. I'm always thrilled when I saw the I Don't Know More flash mobs, because what I saw then was like, okay, we've got it. We got the critical mass. We have connectivity. We have Maori people in Aotearoa who are like hashtagging I Don't Know More, and it's all the way coming from Lummi people, you know, in the Pacific Northwest, you know, and then we've got people all the way down in New Mexico. You know, it's like a really kind of pitiful looking flash mob. There's 5 people, you know, it's like in Gallup. But I don't care, we have connectivity, you know, like, yes, right? And if they can post something, you know, to like Facebook, then they can share documents. And if they can share documents, then that means that there's nerdy, brainy people like me, you know, who are reading them and who are making the connections and who are writing about them, right? So the Indian Education Self-Determination Act was 1978, signed in 1978. Before that, Native peoples, first of all, it was extraordinarily challenging for any Native person to get into college, to go to school, and to be able to finish, right? And then you had to pretend that you didn't know anything about Indians and that you had no interest in studying anything about Indians for years. So my generation was the first generation of Native PhDs who were allowed to study their own people, who were allowed to study their own tribes, right? So, so when I saw Standing Rock, all these young Native people out there, you know, on one hand, because I'm a strong advocate for tribal sovereignty, I was like, well, these people, you know, that's their reservation. Like, you have to respect their land, right? So Native people get that. You can't just go on to somebody. It's like if I decided to have a protest in your backyard, okay? Like, it's kind of rude. So I was like, okay, I could see that. But then I saw all this energy in these Native young people, and I was like, that darn policy worked. Indian Education Self-Determination Act worked. And internet is working. That people are connecting across these spaces. So I see things, for the most oppressed groups in society, I don't see them in terms of 5 years or decades of change. I see them in 30 to 60 years of change. Because it's going to take an act of Congress to really, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, yes, because I agree, but then that for the state is not evidence, you know.
Yeah.
So we need government-to-government relations, language documents, things that, you know, it's so hard for them to access.
Yes, so it's not just evidence, right? Quite frankly, in California, there's lots of evidence, but California will not see it,
I know, yeah.
right? And it's that way in Seattle, it's that way for most Trek, Texas, right?
Yeah.
So to some degree, I am, when I tell like young Native people, I'll talk to them about social media and stuff, and I'll be like, document. You know, you have it now on your phone, like make short films about your family.
Yeah.
You know, make things, record your grandparents talking, you know, just do it. You know, it's just for your family. You don't have to publish it, you don't have to put it online, just keep it somewhere.
Yeah.
And in multiple formats, because I'm a librarian, right? So I'm like, print things out, put it on CD-ROM. They're like, what's a CD? I'm like, oh my God, right? So it's like, we have to go through all that because they're like 18, 19, 20 years old, right? And when it comes to documentation to get recognition, the tribe has to decide whether or not they want recognition, first of all. Is it truly politically, economically, socially powerful for them? And number two, they have to have enough financial, social, political clout to even get there. And that takes decades. So they may have a documentation, but if they don't have non-native partners to help them with it, a lot of times they won't even get their foot in the door.
Yeah.
So it's not just that matter of getting this, it's kind of a trick, okay? Federal recognition tells us as tribal people, you guys get to be a tribe if you know your language, have proof of ceremonial history, have proof of relationship with the land, like through treaties and whatever, before your American colonization, and that you are one people, truly, through like genealogical records. So tribes are like scrambling, getting this. And I'm like, you guys, okay, yeah, we'll get that all together. But what we really need is a friend in the Department of Interior.
Yeah.
So, thank you. I mean, I sort of had two questions, or maybe they're related to one another. One is like, I really appreciated your use of the term epistemic justice, and I was actually thinking about whether that term is appropriate, actually, as we think about what most libraries represent,
Yes.
vis-a-vis what most kind of communities where knowledge is sort of situated and process-based, and it is not about like discrete objectness and objecthood, if you know what I mean. So like the distinction between those two and how we think of libraries and information institutions, I think it's a good start to think about them located on Indigenous land that are run, owned, and managed by Indigenous peoples. But there's something like fundamentally, I guess the word I use is incommensurable, about ways of knowing that see knowledge as process, as environmental, as located in space and time in a situated manner versus actually just on almost any level what museums, archives, and libraries are doing on a fundamentally like philosophical and epistemological level. And it's sort of like, I know you're like one of the best of the fighters out there, and actually we need more people like yourself of Native descent who are working in these kinds of institutions, because I know, I just sort of like believe that with people like you leading such projects, that bridges will occur, but I actually still can't figure out what those bridges actually look like, to be completely honest, even with the response you gave to Carlin's question.
Yeah, do you want to see this really terrible, okay, this is, so my students make fun of me. When I know, so like I'll teach, right, and I have a whiteboard, so I usually don't teach with PowerPoint, I just have a whiteboard and a pen, and by the end of it, it's like,
did you draw that?
Yes, it's like a kid with crayons, like the arrows pointing back at themselves, you know. So I made a graph for you that actually does have an arrow pointing back at itself. It was just for you. Yeah, no. He was like, I'm going to wait for Marisa Duarte to drink a lot of coffee and diagram my entire book. So, so that's kind of an apology, but I'm just going to, okay, so epistemic justice as just a citation, Jose Medina. The book is called Epistemology of Resistance. Epistemology of the Oppressed. I don't know, Jose Medina. And he gives a very clear definition of what epistemic, how it works in terms of habits of mind. It's super helpful. But, so this is the way I'm working on it right now. Okay, so coloniality works, right, because there's 4 mechanisms. If you want to colonize a different planet, just FYI, this is what you need to do. Just don't give Elon Musk the truth. I'll pretend I didn't. I didn't make it. So the first thing that you do, right, is you sort of you erect institutions to classify the population, right? You create this sort of elite that's going to oversee those institutions and ensure that classification. You take the lands and you redistribute it to the elite, right? And then you put your sort of claim to truth and knowledge way at the top, right? And epistemic injustice is happening here in this claim, okay? So our institutions, here's the libraries, universities, and churches, this is what we're doing. We're unwittingly sort of upholding this colonial mechanism. And because for us, our little world is over here. We don't see any of this. This is the part where my undergrads were like, oh my God, now she's walking too. Okay, so this is where we are. This is where we live, right? And like me, I'm over here, I'm an elite, I'm an indigenous elite, and I'm doing this kind of thing. And I'm trying to convince people about intellectual property issues. We need to unthink that. I'm trying to work in these institutions, but really I'm like an American citizen elite and I'm working over here, right? Okay, so, however, I put this square over here. We have this concept of the reserve. This is a very old concept. Heidegger talks about this in The Question Concerning Technology. He says that, we're a superhuman, super advancing nation or group of technological people, and we are going to start innovating just for the sake of innovating. God is dead, but we're innovating for the sake of innovating, right? And where are we going to get fresh ideas? Well, we have to have a reserve. Now, Heidegger was a Nazi. Who did they put on reserves? Who did the Nazis put in the reserves? That's right. And who else did they put on reserves? American Indians. And they said that they were natural and wild. And that, if we put them on the reserves later on in the US, we can go in there and take what we need to further colonize, right? Because we need that natural resources, that water, that oil, whatever, right? So this is the reserve. And a lot of people think, so we use these terms right now to describe the reserve. And you can tell that when people use these terms, they're thinking of that reserve for the nation state. So they don't talk about peoples, they talk about populations. The American Indian population, or they talk about citizens like populations, like Americans as populations, right? Okay, and then they don't talk about like waters, lands, trees, or like the way Native people do, which is, our horse nation, our plant nation, or whatever. They talk about them in terms of natural resources.
So it's quantification and scientization
Yes.
in both cases, but
And here's where we are, right? We take the world down to data, information, knowledge. But we know that really, this is where anybody who's done any field ethnography, you go out there, your mind is clear, you're out there, you're doing your thing, and you're like, oh my God, I have no words for what I saw, right? Because you're like, oh my God, this is shit. Like, there's this whole, like there's all this that I'm seeing, and I have to translate it and make it truth, right? Okay, now where we are now,
this is exactly what I'm asking.
yes, I made this just for you.
It's
Yeah.
exactly what I'm right.
Yes, so the Onto power stuff, right? So this is where Brian Massimi is like so, I think that military theory is very important to me, right? Is because he is, and I agree with this, what's happening right now, so this is before the election.
Do you guys know Brian Massimi? Yeah.
So the day before, the book is called Onto Power, but the day before the election, my undergrads were freaking out, right? So I said, okay, they're like, what's going to happen? This is a theories of justice class, and I've got Trump supporters, and I've got immigrants' right advocates, and I've got Black Lives Matter, and I've got law enforcement, 45 of them in one classroom, right? And so I said, listen, y'all, this is what's going to happen, right? We've got hyper neoliberalism and hyper neoconservatism at once, which neoliberalism extracts and it compels people. People want to give to neoliberalism because it's so shiny and cool. Like this damn phone, right? Prosumption. I'm a prosumer. I'm like, oh, I'll take a picture of myself and I don't care if Google owns it because I'm really cute, I mean, I'm just giving my body away, right? So that's neoliberalism. Okay, and neoconservatism, on the other hand, it punishes people. It tells them how the world ought to be. It points at law and order. And it says that the regime needs to be this way, structured this way, right? And so people in the US like to think that liberalism and conservatism are like this. No, they work in an infinite balance, right? And so what we've got with neoconservatism, we can see the neocons at work at DAPL, the DAPL officers, right? But as soon as they join forces with DAPL Private Security, Morton County officers, joins forces with DAPL Security, that blue line is neoliberal processes. All of a sudden it makes perfect sense for us that private security, that the government would be protecting a private corporation, right? Because they have to contain the wild Indians who are out there. They're not on the reserve. They're a swarm coming from God knows where. Tribal people, non-tribal people, oh my, there's white people at Standing Rock, like national emergency, because now all of a sudden it's showing that American Indian is not just race, it's a way of thinking. That indigeneity is a way of thinking, right? That was terrifying for folks. So they circled up, and I drew this little map.
So, and like my just second part of that is actually thinking about data and surveillance and analytics, which is what I'm like going crazy about these days, in relation to all of that, and actually, when we're telling that kind of happy story that I've done with Tucker Square and you're doing with DAPL and Native American, connections across spaces, we're also seeing that as the uses of liberal surveillance and data power providing technologies that might help us communicate with one another, but doesn't necessarily topple or affect institutional and economic power.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So I'm doing a wearable tech study right now with Native people, right? And I basically took off all my wearable tech, just the odometers and stuff, because I was really scared of surveillance. I put VPN on everything. I took a bunch of data sets off the cloud, because I knew that we were becoming surveilled. And it wasn't Morton County, law enforcement surveillance, it was the FBI, and it was most certainly, Department of Homeland Security, without a doubt.
And it's Facebook.
Yes. Yeah, corporate plus government. And so Michael Chertoff, this is a really, Michael Chertoff actually, there's this new, so a lot of people in the cybersecurity space think that citizen privacy rights and security, government security are incompatible, but they actually work together in a really important way, right? Why? Because it's the same thing, right? If your people are free, they will innovate new ideas. and the neocons don't want to stop innovation because who pays for their weapons? All that innovation, right? So it's like these are an important balance. But Chertoff, as I mentioned, he's just like, on the ground intelligence is still better for catching actual terrorists rather than, doing the network analytics to try to find alleged terrorists or, networks of, right? This is the language they use, networks of, right? And he's saying that precisely because he's like, people, if they know they're being surveilled, they will stop producing what's important for this country in terms of, he was, talking about creativity and intellect, what's patentable. So when Chertoff says that he was telling people in the room, use VPN, I don't use social media, the ISPs are confused about me, he said, because he does New York Times crosswords and he Googles for what's in it, so it's like his trail is all messed up, his browsing history is like, some obscure stuff. But yeah, I'm as you are, deeply concerned about that as well.
This is sort of asking an extrapolation, so I understand that it's not an easy thing to ask too, but I share the whole set of concerns you were just talking about in terms of why we have to be worried about data sovereignty and security, but there's also just the reality of it with activists that it's on Facebook, it was the only way anything was seen.
Yes.
I was working with my partner and she was like working there on the ground for a few parts
Yep.
of it, and we're talking like how can we, as someone who's a media archivist, there's these conversations, how are we keeping it from, not everything was kept from going up, but a lot of stuff went up and was taken down.
Yes.
A little bit we saw, like we said at the beginning of the talk, right, was only because we could use. I've sort of gone off, I've come to the place of being like, I'm not going to tell people to get off Facebook anymore because the answer does not, you have to get towards something or you have to get better in how you use it because it's not as simple as that we can bring our people with us,
Right.
then in our network with us, then into a major transference. So I don't know if there's, in studying these Twitter data sets and looking at these patterns, whether you were starting and being part of these other creations of alternative systems.
Yeah.
If you're starting to see hopeful places that we can give as a suggestion where we help people towards.
Stuff.
Yeah.
So Tracy Rector of Longhouse Media she just put out a call for if anybody knows of any databases where that shared footage can be stored. I had been trying to convince people to use Yokai Beckler's. Is it Yokai Beckler's? I could be wrong about that. What is it? What is it called? No, he's working with the team and they created an alternative social network, and it's based off of pods around the world, diaspora.org. And I had been I sent notes to a bunch of indigenous colleagues like, y'all, we might have to do this for real, so just set up the account, we don't have to use it right now, but just do it, right? And I had even thought about things like reaching out to First Nations friends who run network servers, who run backbones in First Nations reservations, in case we needed protection. But then I found out that Canada was surveilling their journalists too, and they weren't letting people cross the border, and I was just like, you know what? So I agree with you that when I think about remembering that the impulse is to contain and isolate, radical people, I'm like, this at this point is worth it. Nobody has been killed yet for this. But in Ryoyaki, people were being killed yet for that. So it's like, okay, right? Yes. I'm still in the US trusting that we are going to stand up for free speech. I really am.
And in Mexico, journalists have been killed like crazy in this, especially in South Mexico and Ayotzinapa.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, shall we hang out upstairs and have some laughs? Thank you so much.